The dust never settled in Arizona territory. It hung in the air like a curse, coating everything in the color of dried blood and broken promises. August 1878 had been merciless, with temperatures that could kill a man and Apache war parties that moved like shadows across the desert floor. At Fort Valiant, the flag hung limp against its pole, too exhausted even to wave. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Marcus Dalton stood on the ramparts, squinting through the heat shimmer that made the horizon dance like water. 3 men lost this week, 2 to Apache arrows, 1 to the desert itself when his horse threw him 20 miles from the nearest water. The fort was running on fumes and prayer, and Dalton knew it. What he didn't know was that in less than an hour, everything would change. Lieutenant Thomas Brennan crouched behind a boulder, his cavalry hat pulled low against the glare. Sweat carved clean lines through the dust on his face as he watched the Apache war party moving through Devil's Canyon below. 7 riders, maybe 8. War paint gleaming on their faces like fresh blood, feathers dancing in their horses' manes. They moved with the fluid grace of men who had been born to this land, who understood its secrets in ways that no white soldier ever would. Tom had been tracking them for 3 days, ever since they'd hit the supply wagon near Mesquite Creek. The driver and his guard were found with arrows in their backs and their scalps missing. It was Chief Running Bear's signature, swift and brutal. The Apache leader had been quiet for months, and Tom had hoped maybe the old warrior was finally ready to talk peace. But hope was a luxury that men like Tom couldn't afford for long. He checked his rifle, counted his ammunition, 12 rounds. Not enough for 8 Apache warriors, not if they spotted him first. But Tom had learned patience during his 5 years in the territory. Patience and the ability to move through this country like smoke, invisible until he chose to be seen. The Apaches had taught him that, ironically enough, you learned from your enemies out here, or you died. The war party disappeared around a bend, heading north toward the main trail. Tom's blood turned cold. The main trail meant the stage road. The stage road meant civilians. And today was Thursday, which meant the weekly supply run from Tucson was due any time now. He scrambled down the rocky slope, his boots sending small avalanches of stone cascading into the canyon. His horse, a tough sorrel gelding named Copper, waited patiently in the shade of a mesquite tree. Tom had named him for his coat, which matched the color of the desert rock at sunset. The horse had carried him through 3 Apache ambushes and never flinched. In this country, a good horse was worth more than gold, and Copper was the best. Tom swung into the saddle and urged Copper forward at a steady lope. The stage road was 5 miles north, winding through a series of rocky defiles. That provided perfect cover for an ambush. If Running Bear's warriors reached it first, anyone on that road would be riding into a death trap. Tom had seen the aftermath of Apache attacks before. It wasn't something a man forgot, and it wasn't something he let happen again, if he could help it. The sun beat down mercilessly as Tom and Copper ate up the miles. The landscape here was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, all red rock and thorned plants that seemed to thrive on suffering. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels, their arms raised in permanent surrender to the sky. In the distance, Thunder Mesa rose like a sleeping giant, its flat top shimmering in the heat. Tom had been born in Pennsylvania, where the hills were green and the rivers ran year-round. But 5 years in Arizona territory had changed him, burned away everything soft and left behind something harder, more focused. The desert did that to a man. It stripped him down to his essentials, showed him what he was really made of. Some men broke under that kind of scrutiny. Others, like Tom, discovered they were stronger than they'd ever imagined. He reached the stage road just as the dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon. The stagecoach was still 2 miles out, moving at a steady pace that suggested the driver had no idea what was waiting for him. Tom pulled out his field glasses and swept the surrounding hills. There, hidden among the rocks on the eastern ridge, he caught the glint of sunlight on metal. Apache warriors, already in position. Tom had perhaps 10 minutes before the stage reached the killing ground. Not enough time to ride back and warn them. Not enough time to circle around and attack the Apaches from behind. But maybe, just maybe, enough time to even the odds a little. He guided Copper off the road and into a maze of boulders that would provide cover. From here, he could see the entire ambush site. The Apaches had chosen their ground well. The road curved sharply between 2 low hills, forcing the stage to slow down. Once the coach was in the defile, there would be no escape. Tom settled behind a large rock and checked his rifle again. 12 rounds. He'd have to make each one count. The plan was simple in the way that desperate plans often were. Wait for the Apaches to reveal themselves, then create enough chaos to give the stage a chance to escape. It probably wouldn't work, but it was the only chance anyone had. The stagecoach came into view, a dusty brown rectangle bouncing and swaying as it navigated the rough road. Tom could see the driver clearly now, a grizzled man in a floppy hat, who was probably thinking about nothing more than getting to Fort Valiant in time for supper. Beside him sat a guard with a shotgun across his knees, alert but not alarmed. They had no idea that death was waiting in the rocks above them. As the stage entered the defile, Tom saw movement on the ridges. The Apache warriors rose from concealment. Like shadows given form, their bows already drawn. In a few seconds, arrows would fill the air like deadly rain. Tom took a deep breath, sighted on the nearest warrior, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot cracked across the desert like thunder, and the Apache warriors spun and fell. Immediately, the peaceful afternoon exploded into chaos. War cries echoed off the canyon walls as the remaining warriors scrambled for new positions. The stage driver hauled back on his reins, his eyes wide with terror as he realized what was happening. The guard brought up his shotgun, searching for targets among the rocks. Tom worked the bolt of his rifle and fired again, then again. His shots were precise, each one carefully aimed. But the Apaches were moving now, flowing across the landscape like water, and hitting them was like trying to shoot smoke. Arrows began to whistle through the air, some striking the rocks near Tom's position with sharp cracks. From his hiding place, Tom watched the drama unfold below. The stage driver was trying to turn his team around, but the road was too narrow and the horses were panicking. The guard managed to get off one barrel of his shotgun before an arrow sprouted from his shoulder and sent him tumbling from the driver's seat. The driver grabbed for the fallen shotgun just as another arrow punched through his hat. That's when Tom saw her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The stage door flew open and a woman emerged, not cowering or screaming as he might have expected, but moving with purposeful determination. She was dressed in a traveling outfit of dark blue wool, her hair pinned up beneath a small hat that had somehow managed to stay in place despite the chaos around her. She climbed onto the driver's seat, helped the wounded guard down to the shelter of the coach body, then grabbed the reins of the terrified horses. Tom stared in amazement as the woman calmed the team with a series of sharp commands. She had obviously handled horses before, and handled them well. Within moments, she had the stage moving again, not back the way they'd come but forward, toward the narrowest part of the defile. It was either the bravest thing Tom had ever seen, or the most foolish. An Apache warrior appeared on a ledge directly above the moving stage, his bow drawn and aimed at the woman. Tom didn't think, just reacted. His rifle barrel swung up and he fired, the bullet taking the warrior in the chest and spinning him off the ledge. The woman glanced up, saw Tom among the rocks, and for one brief moment, their eyes met across the chaos of battle. In that instant, Tom felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't name and didn't have time to examine. The woman's eyes were green, he noticed, green as spring grass in a country where spring was just a rumor. She raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a salute, then turned her attention back to driving the stage through hell. Tom continued firing, picking his shots carefully as his ammunition dwindled. The Apaches were pulling back now, melting into the rocks as quickly as they had appeared. They had lost 3 warriors to Tom's rifle, and the element of surprise was gone. Running Bear was too smart a war chief to waste men on a failed ambush. The stage cleared the defile and continued north toward Fort Valiant, the woman still holding the reins. Tom watched until it disappeared around a bend, then gathered his gear and made his way back to Copper. His hands were shaking slightly as he reloaded his rifle, not from fear but from something else entirely. The memory of those green eyes stayed with him as he rode north, following the stage at a distance. By the time Tom reached Fort Valiant, the sun was setting behind Thunder Mesa, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The fort's gates stood open, and he could see the stagecoach in the courtyard, surrounded by soldiers and civilians. Captain Dalton spotted him as he rode in and strode over, his face grim. "Brennan, where the hell have you been?" "We heard gunfire from the south, and when the stage came in shot full of arrows with a woman driving it, I figured you might know something about it." Tom dismounted and handed Copper's reins to a waiting private. "Apache war party hit the stage in Devil's Canyon, sir. Running Bear's bunch, maybe 8 warriors. The driver and guard both took arrows, but they'll live. The woman, she—" He paused, searching for words. "She saved their lives, Captain. Took over the team and drove them right through the ambush." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "A woman did that? Who is she?" "Don't know, sir. Haven't had a chance to ask." As if summoned by their conversation, the woman appeared at the door of the fort's main building. She had changed out of her traveling clothes and now wore a simple dress of green cotton that matched her eyes. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, catching the last light of the setting sun. She looked around the courtyard until her gaze found Tom, and she began walking toward them. Tom found himself straightening his uniform jacket and trying to brush some of the trail dust from his sleeves. It was a futile gesture. After 3 days in the desert, he looked like exactly what he was, a soldier who had been living rough and fighting for his life. But something about the woman's approach made him want to present himself better. She stopped a few feet away and extended her hand, first to Captain Dalton and then to Tom. Her grip was firm, her gaze direct. "Gentlemen, I'm Catherine Hartwell, though most people call me Kate. I believe I owe one of you my life." Captain Dalton gestured toward Tom. "That would be Lieutenant Brennan, ma'am. He's the one who kept those Apaches from turning you into a pincushion." Kate turned those remarkable green eyes on Tom, and he felt something twist in his chest. "Then I'm in your debt, Lieutenant. The driver told me someone was shooting from the rocks, keeping the warriors pinned down while we escaped. I assume that was you?" Tom nodded, suddenly feeling awkward and tongue-tied. "Just doing my job, ma'am. Couldn't let civilians get hurt if I could help it." "Your job," she repeated, and there was something in her voice he couldn't quite read. "I see. Well, whatever you want to call it, you saved lives today. The driver, Jake Morrison, has a wife and 3 children in Tucson. The guard, Charlie Pine, has a sweetheart he's planning to marry come Christmas. They're both alive because you were in the right place at the right time." "What brings you to Fort Valiant, Miss Hartwell?" Captain Dalton asked. "We don't get many ladies traveling alone through Apache country." Kate's cheeks colored slightly, and for the first time since Tom had laid eyes on her, she seemed less than completely self-possessed. "I'm here to meet someone, Captain. A gentleman with whom I've been corresponding. We have an arrangement." Tom felt his heart sink. Of course she was here to meet someone. A woman like that wouldn't be traveling alone unless she had a destination and a purpose. Would this gentleman be someone from the fort? He heard himself asking. Actually, yes. Sergeant William Hayes. Perhaps you know him? Tom and Captain Dalton exchanged glances. They both knew Bill Hayes, a career soldier who was pushing 50 and had never been married. A good man, reliable and steady, but Tom had never thought of him as the type to correspond with women or make arrangements of any kind. Bill was the sort who thought a letter from his sister back in Ohio was a major social event. Yes, ma'am, we know Sergeant Hayes, Captain Dalton said carefully. Fine soldier, been with us for 3 years. He's out on patrol right now, but we expect him back tomorrow evening. I see. Kate looked around the fort again, taking in the adobe walls, the wooden buildings, the handful of women who were wives of officers or enlisted men. It's smaller than I expected. Most things are, out here, Tom said, and immediately wished he hadn't. It sounded philosophical and pretentious, neither of which he had intended. But Kate smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her. I suspect you're right about that, Lieutenant. Back in St. Louis, everything seemed larger and more important than it probably was. Distance has a way of changing perspective. You came from St. Louis? Tom asked. It was a long way from the comfortable civilization of Missouri to the harsh frontier of Arizona Territory. That's quite a journey. 3 weeks by train and stagecoach, Kate confirmed, though the last part proved more exciting than I had anticipated. She touched her throat unconsciously, and Tom noticed a small bruise there that might have come from the leather reins during her wild ride through the ambush. Captain Dalton cleared his throat. Miss Hartwell, we'll see that you're made comfortable until Sergeant Hayes returns. Mrs. Whitman, the doctor's wife, has offered to put you up in their quarters. It's not fancy, but it's clean and safe. That's very kind. I don't require much in the way of comfort. Kate glanced around the fort again, and Tom found himself wondering what she was thinking. Was she having second thoughts about her arrangement with Bill Hayes? Was she disappointed by the primitive conditions? Or was she simply taking the measure of the place that might become her home? If you'll excuse me, Captain Dalton said, I need to check on the wounded men and file a report about today's incident. Lieutenant Brennan, would you escort Miss Hartwell to the Whitman quarters? It wasn't really a request, and Tom nodded. Of course, sir. As Captain Dalton walked away, Tom found himself alone with Kate for the first time. In the gathering twilight, she looked younger somehow, less composed. The events of the day were catching up with her, he realized. Being shot at by Apache warriors wasn't something you just shrugged off, no matter how brave you were. This way, Miss Hartwell, he said, gesturing toward a low building near the north wall of the fort. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments, their footsteps echoing off the hard-packed earth of the courtyard. The fort was settling into its evening routine, with sentries taking their positions on the walls and cook fires beginning to flicker to life. It was peaceful, almost domestic, and Tom found himself wondering what Kate thought of it all. May I ask you something, Lieutenant? She said as they approached the Whitman quarters. Of course. During the ambush when you were shooting at the Apache warriors, were you afraid? Tom considered the question. Most people assumed that soldiers were either fearless or cowards, with nothing in between. The truth was more complicated. I was afraid, he said finally, but not of dying. I was afraid I wouldn't be fast enough or accurate enough to make a difference. Fear can sharpen your focus if you don't let it paralyze you. Kate nodded slowly. I was terrified when those arrows started flying. But I kept thinking that if I gave in to the fear, if I just cowered in the stage and hoped for the best, then everyone would die. The driver, the guard, maybe even you. So I had to do something, even if it was the wrong thing. It wasn't the wrong thing, Tom said quietly. It was exactly the right thing. Not many people would have had the courage to take those reins. Courage? Kate laughed, but there was no humor in it. I don't think it was courage, Lieutenant. I think it was just stubbornness. I've come too far and given up too much to die in a ditch in Arizona territory. There was something in her voice, a hint of loss or regret that made Tom want to ask more questions. But they had reached the Whitman quarters, and the moment passed. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman appeared in the doorway, a plump, motherly woman in her 40s who had somehow managed to create a pocket of civilization in the middle of the wilderness. "Miss Hartwell, my dear, you must be exhausted after your ordeal. Come in, come in. I have hot water for washing and a good supper waiting." She turned to Tom with a smile. "Thank you for escorting her, Lieutenant. Will you join us for supper?" Tom felt Kate's eyes on him and realized he wanted very much to accept the invitation. But Sergeant Hayes was his friend, and Kate was here to meet Hayes, not him. "Thank you, ma'am, but I need to check on my horse and file my report." "Of course, another time perhaps." As Tom turned to go, Kate spoke his name. "Lieutenant Brennan?" He turned back, and she stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair. "Thank you," she said simply. "For today, for everything, I won't forget it." For a moment, Tom thought she might say something more. Her green eyes seemed to be searching his face for something, some answer to a question she wasn't asking. But then Mrs. Whitman bustled out to collect Kate's traveling bag, and the moment was broken. Tom walked back across the courtyard, his mind churning with thoughts and questions he couldn't answer. Kate Hartwell was here to marry Bill Hayes, a good man who deserved happiness after years of faithful service. That was the arrangement she had mentioned. Tom was sure of it. Mail-order brides weren't uncommon on the frontier, where women were. Scarce and lonely men were plentiful. But as Tom unsaddled Copper and rubbed the horse down, he couldn't shake the memory of those green eyes or the way Kate had handled the frightened horses during the ambush. She was unlike any woman he had ever met, combining courage and intelligence with a beauty that seemed to come from within as much as without. Bill Hayes was a lucky man, and Tom tried to feel happy for his friend. He tried, but he couldn't quite manage it. Morning came early at Fort Valiant, announced by the bugle call that echoed off the adobe walls and sent the desert birds scattering into the pale sky. Tom had been awake for hours, staring at the rough wooden ceiling of his quarters, and thinking about green eyes and the sound of arrows whistling through the air. Sleep had been elusive, chased away by memories of the previous day's events and questions he couldn't answer. He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on his uniform with the automatic movements of a man who had done the same thing 1,000 times before. Outside, the fort was stirring to life. Sentries called out their reports from the walls. Cook fires were being kindled in the mess hall, and the stable hands were beginning their morning rounds. It was a routine as old as the army itself, comforting in its predictability. Tom made his way to the stables, where Copper greeted him with a soft whinny. The horse had recovered well from yesterday's hard ride, but Tom checked him over carefully anyway. In Apache country, a lame horse could mean the difference between life and death, and Tom had learned never to take chances with his mount's health. As he worked, brushing Copper's coat and checking his hooves, Tom found himself thinking about Kate Hartwell. He wondered if she had slept well, if Mrs. Whitman had made her comfortable, if she was having second thoughts about her decision to come west. Marriage to a frontier soldier was no easy life, even for a woman as capable as Kate seemed to be. "You're up early, Lieutenant." Tom turned to see Captain Dalton approaching, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. The captain looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much either. Command of an isolated frontier post was never easy, but lately it had become nearly impossible. Too few men, too much territory to patrol, and Apache war parties growing bolder with each passing week. "Couldn't sleep, sir," Tom admitted. "Kept thinking about yesterday's attack. Running bears getting more aggressive. That ambush was well planned, well executed. if I hadn't been tracking them. But you were, Dalton said firmly. And because you were, 3 people are alive today who might otherwise be dead. Don't second-guess yourself, Tom. Out here, we do what we can with what we have, and we don't look back. Tom nodded, but the captain's words didn't ease the tension in his shoulders. Any word from the patrol, sir? When will Sergeant Hayes be back? Dalton's expression darkened. That's what's keeping me awake. They should have been back yesterday evening. I'm giving them until noon, then I'm sending out a search party. He paused, studying Tom's face. I don't suppose your interest in Hayes's return has anything to do with our unexpected guest. Tom felt heat rise in his cheeks. Miss Hartwell is here to see the sergeant, sir. That's his business, not mine. Is it? Dalton's voice was mild, but his eyes were sharp. Because from where I was standing yesterday evening, it looked like there might be some complications developing. Before Tom could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Both men turned toward the fort's main gate, where a lone rider was approaching at a steady gallop. Tom recognized the horse first, then the rider. Private Danny Sullivan, one of Hayes's patrol, his uniform torn and bloody, his face grim with exhaustion and something else. Fear. Sullivan pulled his lathered horse to a stop in the courtyard, and half fell from the saddle. Tom caught him as his legs gave out, and he could see that the young soldier had taken an arrow in his left shoulder. The wound had been roughly bandaged, but blood had soaked through the cloth. Captain, Sullivan gasped, we need help. Sergeant Hayes and the others, they're pinned down at Eagle Rock. Apache war party, maybe 20 warriors. We rode into an ambush at dawn yesterday. Lost Miller and Jackson right off. The rest of us made it to the rocks, but we're surrounded. Dalton's face went pale. Eagle Rock was 15 miles southeast, a defensive position but isolated and exposed. If Hayes and his men were trapped there with 20 Apache warriors circling them, their situation was desperate. How many men are left? Dalton demanded. 5, sir, counting the sergeant. But Peterson's got an arrow in his leg, and Kowalski took a bullet in the ribs. They're holding on, but they won't last another day without help. Tom was already moving, his mind racing through possibilities. 20 Apache warriors was more than the entire garrison at Fort Valiant could handle in open battle. But a rescue mission, carefully planned and executed, might work. It would be dangerous, perhaps suicidal, but it was the only chance Hayes and his men had. Captain, Tom said, give me 20 men and I can get them out. Dalton shook his head grimly. I can't spare 20 men, Tom. If I send that many, we'll leave the fort defenseless. 10 men maximum. 10 men against 20 Apache warriors. The odds were terrible, but Tom had seen impossible odds overcome before. 10 men then. But I choose them. Agreed. When do you leave? Tom glanced at the eastern sky, where the sun was just beginning to rise above the desert hills. Within the hour. We'll need to move fast and hit them before they realize we're coming. As Dalton hurried away to organize the rescue party, Tom found himself thinking about Kate again. If something happened to Hayes, if the sergeant didn't make it back from Eagle Rock, what would become of her? She had traveled across half the country to marry a man she had never met, given up whatever life she had built in St. Louis. If Hayes died, she would be stranded at Fort Valiant with no money, no family, and no prospects. Tom pushed the thought away. Hayes wouldn't die. Tom would see to that. He owed it to his friend, and he owed it to the woman who had risked her life to save others yesterday. Personal feelings had no place in a military operation, and Tom forced himself to focus on the tactical situation ahead. The rescue party assembled quickly. Tom chose his men carefully, selecting veterans who had experience fighting Apaches and who could be trusted to keep their heads in a crisis. Corporal Frank Morrison, a tough Irish immigrant who had been fighting Indians since before Tom was born. Private Luis Hernandez, a former vaquero whose knowledge of desert warfare was invaluable. 8 others, all seasoned fighters who knew the country and the enemy. As Tom checked his gear one final time, he became aware that someone was watching him. He turned to see Kate standing near the gate, her green eyes fixed on the rescue party with an expression he couldn't read. She had changed into a simpler dress, brown cotton that was more practical than fashionable, and her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She looked like a woman preparing for hard news. Tom walked over to her, unsure what to say. How did you comfort a woman whose intended husband might be dying 15 miles away? How did you explain that you were about to risk your own life to save a man you had never thought of as a rival until yesterday? Miss Hartwell, he said quietly, I wanted you to know that we're going after Sergeant Hayes and his men. We'll bring them back. Kate's eyes searched his face, and Tom had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him, past all his military training and professional composure to the confusion beneath. Will you? She asked. Or will you simply add more names to the casualty list? The question stung because it was fair. Military rescues often ended in disaster, with the rescuers joining the rescued in death. Tom had seen it happen before. Good men dying in futile attempts to save others who were already beyond help. I don't know, he admitted. But we have to try. Hayes is a good man, and he's got soldiers depending on him. We don't leave our people behind. Kate nodded slowly. He wrote to me about that, about the bonds between soldiers. He said it was something civilians couldn't understand, the way men who fight together become brothers. She paused, studying Tom's face. Are you and Sergeant Hayes close friends? We served together, Tom said carefully. That makes us brothers. In arms, even if we're not close personally. It was a diplomatic answer, but Kate's expression suggested she wasn't fooled. The truth was more complicated. Tom respected Hayes as a soldier and trusted him in combat, but they had never been particularly close. Hayes was older, more set in his ways, content with army routine in a way that Tom had never been. They were friendly but not friends, colleagues, but not confidants. Miss Hartwell, Tom said, I want you to know that whatever happens, you'll be taken care of. Captain Dalton is a good man, and the Army doesn't abandon its obligations. Kate's laugh was short and bitter. Its obligations? Is that what I am, Lieutenant? An obligation? Tom realized he had said the wrong thing, but before he could correct himself, Captain Dalton called out that the rescue party was ready to move. Tom touched his hat brim in a quick salute and turned toward his horse. Lieutenant. Kate's voice stopped him, and he turned back. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough to smell the faint scent of soap and lavender. Bring him back, she said quietly. Bring them all back. Not because it's your duty or your obligation, but because they're human beings with people who care about them. Sergeant Hayes may not have family, but he has me. And you, who do you have? The question caught Tom off guard. Who did he have? His parents were dead, killed in a railroad accident when he was 20. He had no siblings, no wife, no children. The Army was his family, his fellow soldiers his only real connections. If he died at Eagle Rock today, who would mourn him besides his comrades? I have my duty, he said finally, knowing it sounded hollow even as he said it. Kate's expression softened, and for a moment Tom thought she might say something more. But then Captain Dalton called his name again, and the moment passed. The rescue party rode out of Fort Valiant as the sun climbed higher into the desert sky. Tom led them southeast toward Eagle Rock, following game trails and dry creek beds. That would provide cover from Apache scouts. The country here was rough and broken, all red sandstone mesas and deep arroyos that could hide an army. It was perfect Apache territory, which was why Running Bear had chosen it for his ambush. They rode. Tom found himself thinking about Kate's question. Who did he have? The honest answer was nobody, at least nobody outside the army. He had chosen the military life partly because it offered structure and purpose, but also because it demanded nothing from him that he wasn't willing to give. There were no emotional entanglements, no messy personal relationships to complicate his decisions. But now, riding through the desert toward what might be his death, Tom realized that emotional detachment came with a price. If he died today, he would leave behind no legacy except his service record. No children to carry on his name, no wife to remember him with love, no friends to tell stories about him in years to come. It was a lonely way to live and an even lonelier way to die. The rescue party made good time across the desert, covering the 15 miles to Eagle Rock in just over 3 hours. As they approached the position, Tom called a halt and dismounted to study the situation through his field glasses. Eagle Rock was a natural fortress, a pile of massive sandstone boulders that rose 50 feet above the surrounding desert floor. It was defensible, but it was also a trap. Anyone inside could hold off a larger force, but they couldn't escape. Tom could see the Apache position surrounding the rock formation. The warriors had taken cover behind smaller rocks and in shallow depressions, creating a rough circle around their quarry. They were patient, content to wait and let thirst and heat do their work. It was a classic Apache siege, and it was working. From his position, Tom could see the muzzle flashes when Hayes's men returned Apache fire. The soldiers were still alive and fighting, but their ammunition wouldn't last forever. Neither would their water in this heat. Tom gathered his men around him and outlined his plan. It was simple but dangerous. Corporal Morrison would take half the rescue party and create a diversion on the north side of Eagle Rock, drawing the Apache attention. Meanwhile, Tom would lead the other half in a direct assault on the south side, breaking through the siege line and reaching the trapped soldiers. Once we're inside the perimeter, Tom explained, we'll have to fight our way out again. The Apaches will close the gap behind us, and we'll be trapped just like Hayes and his men. So we'll need to move fast and hit hard. Any questions? There were none. These were veteran soldiers who understood the risks and accepted them. They checked their weapons one final time, tightened their saddle cinches, and prepared to ride into hell. Tom looked back toward Fort Valiant, invisible now beyond the heat shimmer and the rolling hills. Somewhere back there, Kate Hartwell was waiting for news. She had asked him to bring Hayes back, and Tom intended to keep that promise. Not because it was his duty, but because she had asked him to. The distinction mattered more than he cared to admit. The attack began with Morrison's diversion. The corporal and his men appeared on the north side of Eagle Rock, firing their rifles and shouting war cries. The Apache warriors responded immediately, turning their attention toward this new threat and leaving their southern positions lightly defended. Tom led his group in a thundering charge across the open desert, his horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. The remaining Apache sentries saw them coming and raised their rifles, but Tom's men were already firing from horseback, their bullets kicking up dust and rock chips around the enemy positions. An Apache warrior rose from behind a boulder, his rifle aimed at Tom's chest. Tom drew his Colt revolver and fired without consciously aiming, the bullet taking the warrior in the shoulder and spinning him around. Another warrior appeared to Tom's left, an arrow already knocked to his bowstring. Private Hernandez put a rifle bullet through the man's chest before he could draw his bow. Then they were through the siege line and climbing toward the rock formation where Hayes and his men had taken shelter. Tom could see the sergeant now, crouched behind a large boulder with his rifle in his hands. Hayes looked older than Tom remembered, his hair gray with dust and his face lined with exhaustion. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. "Sergeant Hayes!" Tom shouted as he dismounted near the sergeant's position. "Are you hurt?" Hayes grinned weakly. "Nothing that won't heal, Lieutenant. Damn glad to see you, though. We were starting to think nobody was coming, "How many men can travel?" Tom asked, already assessing the tactical situation. The rescue had been the easy part. Getting out again would be much harder. Peterson's got an arrow in his leg, but he can ride. Kowalski's hurt worse. Took a bullet in the ribs. But he's tough, he'll make it. Hayes paused, reloading his rifle. "We lost Miller and Jackson yesterday. Good men." Tom nodded grimly. He had known both soldiers, had served with them for 2 years. Their deaths would have to be mourned later. Right now, the living needed his attention. The Apache warriors were already adapting to the changed situation, closing the gap that Tom's assault had opened and preparing for a counterattack. From his position among the rocks, Tom could see them moving like shadows across the desert floor, their war paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. "We need to move now," Tom told Hayes. "Morrison's diversion won't hold them much longer." The evacuation began immediately. The wounded soldiers were helped onto horses, their injuries roughly bandaged to stop the bleeding. Tom's men formed a defensive perimeter around the group, their rifles ready. In the distance, Tom could hear the sound of Morrison's firefight with the main Apache force. The corporal was buying them time with his men's lives. "Lieutenant," Hayes said as they prepared to move out, "there's something you should know. Running Bear isn't just after scalps and horses. He's planning something bigger, a coordinated attack on all the settlements in this area. We heard them talking before they spotted us. They're gathering warriors from 3 different tribes." Tom felt ice form in his stomach. A coordinated attack by multiple Apache tribes could overwhelm every military post in the territory. Fort Valiant, with its small garrison, would be among the first targets. How many warriors? Could be 100, maybe more. And they're not just raiding anymore. They're trying to drive all the whites out of Apache land permanently. The implications were staggering. If Running Bear succeeded in uniting the tribes, the entire Arizona territory could become a war zone. Settlements would be burned, families massacred, and years of progress wiped out in a matter of weeks. "When?" Tom asked. "Soon, maybe within days. We need to get word to the territorial governor, request reinforcements." Tom nodded, but his mind was racing ahead to more immediate concerns. Right now, they had to survive the next few hours. The larger war could wait. The breakout began with a coordinated charge down the south face of Eagle Rock. Tom led the way, his revolver in one hand and his horse's reins in the other. Behind him came the rescued soldiers, some riding double, all of them firing at the Apache positions as they passed. The desert erupted in gunfire and war cries as the Apache warriors closed in from all sides. Arrows whistled through the air, and rifle bullets whined off the rocks. Tom's horse stumbled as an arrow grazed its flank, but the animal recovered and continued running. To Tom's right, Private Hernandez cried out and slumped forward in his saddle, an Apache arrow protruding from his back. But he managed to stay mounted and keep riding, his face set in grim determination. These were the kind of men the frontier produced, tough as the desert itself and twice as unforgiving. The rescue party fought its way clear of the immediate ambush zone, but the Apache warriors followed, mounted now on their own horses and gaining ground. Tom could see Morrison's group in the distance, also fighting a running battle as they tried to reach the rendezvous point. For the next hour, the desert became a battlefield. Small groups of soldiers and Apache warriors chased each other across the broken landscape, fighting brief, savage engagements before breaking off and regrouping. Tom lost track of individual fights, focusing only on keeping his men together and moving toward Fort Valiant. Gradually, the Apache pressure began to ease. The warriors were brave, but they weren't foolish. They had already lost several men, and the element of surprise was gone. Running Bear called off the pursuit, melting back into the desert as suddenly as he had appeared. Tom's rescue party limped back toward Fort Valiant as the sun began to set behind the western mountains. They had succeeded in their mission, but the cost had been high. 2 men dead at Eagle Rock, 3 more wounded, and now they carried news of an even greater threat approaching. As the fort's adobe walls came into sight, Tom found himself thinking about Kate again. He had kept his promise to bring Hayes back, but he wondered if she understood the price that promise had cost. War wasn't romantic or noble, despite what the newspapers back east claimed. It was brutal and random, and usually pointless, a contest between men who had more in common with each other than with the politicians who sent them to fight. But sometimes, just sometimes, it was necessary. And sometimes, very rarely, it was even worthwhile. Tom hoped this was one of those times, though he suspected he wouldn't know for sure until it was over. The gates of Fort Valiant opened as the rescue party approached, and Tom could see figures waiting in the courtyard. Captain Dalton was there, along with Dr. Whitman and his wife. And standing slightly apart from the others, her green dress catching the last light of the setting sun, was Kate Hartwell. Tom dismounted near the gate and helped Hayes down from his horse. The sergeant was exhausted but uninjured, his uniform torn and dirty, but his spirits intact. He looked around the courtyard with the expression of a man who had expected never to see it again. Kate walked toward them, her face composed but her eyes bright with unshed tears. She stopped in front of Hayes, studying his face as if to assure herself that he was real and whole. "Sergeant Hayes," she said quietly, "I'm Catherine Hartwell. We've been corresponding." Hayes straightened despite his exhaustion, suddenly aware that he was meeting his intended bride for the first time. He pulled off his hat and tried to smooth down his gray hair, a gesture that was both touching and futile given his disheveled condition. "Miss Hartwell," he said formally, "I'm sorry you had to see me like this. I had hoped to make a better first impression." Kate smiled, and Tom felt something twist in his chest at the sight of it. "I think you've made exactly the right impression, Sergeant. A man who risks his life for his duty is the kind of man worth waiting for." Tom turned away, unable to watch the reunion any longer. He had done what he set out to do, had kept his promise to bring Hayes back safely. Now it was time to step aside and let other people's lives continue without him. But as he walked toward the stables to tend to his horse, Tom heard Kate's voice calling his name. He turned back reluctantly, expecting to see her standing with Hayes. Instead, she had followed him, leaving the sergeant talking with Captain Dalton. "Lieutenant," she said when she reached him, "I wanted to thank you for bringing him back, for risking your life to save his." Tom nodded stiffly. "Just doing my job, ma'am." "No," Kate said firmly. "It was more than that, and we both know it. You could have sent someone else to lead the rescue. You didn't have to go yourself." Tom met her green eyes and felt that familiar twist in his chest. Hayes is a good soldier. He deserved to come home. Yes, he did. But that's not why you went, is it? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Tom didn't want to examine too closely. He had gone to Eagle Rock for a lot of reasons, duty and honor and military necessity among them. But Kate was right, there had been another reason too, one that had nothing to do with regulations or orders. "I should check on my horse," Tom said, not answering her question directly. "He took an arrow grazed during the fight." Kate nodded slowly, as if she had received the answer she expected. "Of course. And Lieutenant? I hope someday you find someone worth coming home to yourself." She turned and walked back toward Hayes, leaving Tom standing alone in the gathering darkness. Her words echoed in his mind as he led Copper into the stable and began treating the horse's minor wound. Someone worth coming home to. It was a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of everything Tom had never allowed himself to want. Outside, he could hear Kate and Hayes talking quietly, their voices blending with the normal sounds of evening at a frontier post. Tomorrow they would probably begin making plans for their wedding. Kate would become Mrs. Hayes, the wife of a career soldier, and Tom would go back to his patrols and his reports and his solitary existence. It was the way things were supposed to be, the natural order of a world where duty came before desire. And promises were kept regardless of personal cost. Tom told himself he was satisfied with that arrangement, that it was enough to know he had done the right thing. He told himself that, but he didn't quite believe it. The desert wind carried voices across the courtyard in the early evening hours, fragments of conversation that drifted through the open windows of Tom's quarters like unwelcome visitors. He sat at his small wooden table, trying to focus on the patrol report he was writing, but the words kept blurring together on the page. Outside, he could hear Kate and Sergeant Hayes talking quietly on the porch of the Whitman quarters, their voices low and careful, like people getting acquainted with a stranger. Tom set down his pen and rubbed his eyes, which burned from the desert dust and the strain of the day's fighting. The rescue at Eagle Rock felt like something that had happened weeks ago, not mere hours. Time moved differently out here in the territory, stretching and compressing according to its own mysterious logic. A moment of danger could feel like an eternity, while peaceful days slipped by unnoticed. Through his window, Tom could see Kate gesturing as she spoke, her hands moving in graceful arcs that caught the lamplight. Even from this distance, he could sense the animation in her voice, the kind of enthusiasm that came from someone trying to bridge an awkward gap with words. Hayes sat perfectly still, his posture formal and attentive, nodding at appropriate intervals. They looked like actors in a play, both trying to remember their lines. A knock at his door interrupted Tom's unwilling surveillance. He opened it, to find Captain Dalton, his uniform jacket unbuttoned and his face showing the strain of command. The captain stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, a privilege of rank that Tom didn't begrudge him. "Hell of a day," Dalton said, settling into the room's only other chair. "Hayes fill you in on what they heard about Running Bear's plans?" Tom nodded, turning away from the window and the scene outside. Multiple tribes, coordinated attacks. Could be 100 warriors or more. "When do you think they'll move?" "Soon. Hayes thinks within the week, maybe less." Dalton pulled out a leather pouch and began rolling a cigarette with practiced motions. "I've sent a courier to Fort Apache with a request for reinforcements, but even if they can spare men, it'll take days for them to get here. We're on our own until then." "How many effective soldiers do we have?" 32, counting the walking. "Wounded. Against 100 Apache warriors, that's not what you'd call favorable odds." Tom did the mathematics in his head and didn't like the result. Fort Valiant had been built more for show than defense, a symbol of American authority in a landscape that respected only strength. The walls were adequate against small raiding parties, but a coordinated assault by a large force would overwhelm them quickly. "What about evacuation?" Tom asked. "The civilians, the families?" Dalton lit his cigarette and drew deeply, the tobacco glowing red in the gathering darkness. "Where would they go?" "Tucson's 3 days' ride through Apache country. Phoenix is even farther. And half the women here are married to soldiers who won't abandon their posts." He paused, studying Tom's face. "Including our newest arrival, if things work out the way they're supposed to." Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach. The idea of Kate trapped at Fort Valiant during an Apache siege was almost unbearable. She had survived one attack already, had shown remarkable courage under fire, but siege warfare was different. It was slow and brutal and merciless, wearing down defenders until they made fatal mistakes. "Maybe she could be convinced to leave," Tom said carefully. "Return to St. Louis until the situation stabilizes." "Could be." Dalton's tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. "Of course, that would mean leaving Hayes behind, breaking off their engagement before it really begins. Not many women would do that for a man they just met." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Hayes appeared in the doorway, his uniform cleaned and his hair combed, though he still moved with the careful precision of a man whose body had taken a beating. Behind him stood Kate, her green dress replaced by a simpler gray one that somehow made her eyes look even more vivid. "Captain," he said, touching his hat brim in a casual salute. "Miss Hartwell wanted to thank Lieutenant Brennan personally for today's rescue. I hope we're not interrupting." "Not at all," Dalton replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. "We were just discussing defensive preparations." Kate stepped forward, her gaze moving between Tom and Captain Dalton. "Defensive preparations? Are we expecting another attack?" There was a moment of silence as the three soldiers exchanged glances. Military information was generally kept from civilians, but Kate had already proven she wasn't easily frightened or prone to hysteria. And if she was going to marry into the army, she would need to understand the realities of frontier life. "Yes, ma'am," Tom said finally. "The Apache are planning something larger than usual. We think they'll hit the fort within the week." Kate absorbed this information without visible emotion, though Tom saw her hands tighten slightly at her sides. "I see. And what are our chances of holding them off?" "Better than even," Hayes said quickly, shooting a warning look at Tom. "Fort Valiant has never fallen to Indian attack." It was technically true, but misleading. Fort Valiant had never faced a serious assault by a large force. The previous Apache attacks had been hit-and-run affairs, probing raids designed more to steal horses and supplies than to capture the fort itself. This would be different. Kate seemed to sense the evasion in Hayes's answer. She turned to Tom, her green eyes direct and challenging. "Lieutenant Brennan, what's your assessment of our situation?" Tom found himself caught between military discretion and personal honesty. Kate deserved the truth, especially since her life might depend on it. But telling her the truth meant admitting that Fort Valiant was probably doomed, that everyone inside the walls might be dead within a week. "The situation is serious," he said finally. "We're outnumbered and isolated, but we have good defensive positions and experienced soldiers. A lot depends on how determined the Apache are to take casualties." Kate nodded slowly, as if filing away the information for future reference. "And if the worst happens, if the fort falls?" This time the silence stretched longer. No one wanted to voice what they all knew. If the fort fell, the men would die fighting, and the women would face a fate that was arguably worse. Apache treatment of female captives was not something discussed in polite company. "It won't come to that," Hayes said firmly. "I won't let it." Kate turned to look at him, and Tom saw something flicker across her face. Gratitude, perhaps, or affection. But there was something else too, something that looked almost like disappointment. As if Hayes's protective instincts, however well-meaning, weren't quite what she had hoped for. "I appreciate that, Sergeant," she said quietly. "But I'd rather know what I'm facing than be protected from unpleasant truths." Captain Dalton stubbed out his cigarette and stood up. "Miss Hartwell, I think that's enough military talk for one evening. You've had a long day, and tomorrow will bring its own challenges." He nodded to Hayes. "Sergeant, walk her back to the Whitman quarters. Tom, I'll want to see you first thing in the morning to discuss patrol schedules." It was clearly a dismissal, and everyone understood it. Hayes offered Kate his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and she accepted it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As they walked toward the door, Kate glanced back at Tom. "Good night, Lieutenant. Thank you again for today." "Ma'am," Tom replied, touching his hat brim. After they left, Captain Dalton lingered for a moment, studying Tom's face in the lamplight. "Complicated situation," he said finally. "Yes, sir. Hayes is a good man. Steady, reliable, the kind of soldier you can count on." "Yes, sir, he is the kind of man who deserves happiness after all these years of service." Tom met the captain's gaze steadily. I agree completely, sir. Dalton nodded slowly. I'm sure you do. Just remember that personal feelings have a way of complicating military situations. We can't afford complications right now. After the captain left, Tom sat alone in his quarters, listening to the sounds of the fort settling into its evening routine. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, the sound echoing off the desert hills like a warning. Tom tried to return to his patrol report, but the words still wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself thinking about Kate's question. What's your assessment of our situation? The honest answer was that their situation was nearly hopeless. Fort Valiant was undermanned, undersupplied, and surrounded by hostile territory. If Running Bear could indeed unite multiple Apache tribes, the fort would fall within days of the first assault. The walls were too low, the garrison too small, and there was no possibility of relief arriving in time. But Tom hadn't told Kate that, hadn't told any of them. Sometimes leadership meant maintaining hope even when hope was irrational. Sometimes it meant lying to the people you were supposed to protect, letting them sleep peacefully while you stared at the ceiling and calculated impossible odds. The next morning brought news that made those odds even worse. A Pima scout named Joseph Crow Feather rode into the fort just after dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grin with urgency. The Pima were traditional enemies of the Apache, and their scouts often brought valuable intelligence to the army. But this morning, Crow Feather brought only bad news. Tom found the scout in Captain Dalton's office, speaking in a mixture of English and Spanish that painted a picture of escalating Apache activity throughout the region. 3 separate war parties had been spotted moving north toward Fort Valiant, their numbers estimated at 30 to 40 warriors each. They were carrying more ammunition than usual, suggesting they planned for a prolonged engagement rather than a quick raid. When? Dalton asked in Spanish. Manana, maybe the day after. Crow Feather replied. They wait for the moon to die, then they come like shadows. Tom felt his stomach clench. The new moon was tomorrow night, providing maximum darkness for a surprise attack. It was classic Apache tactics, hitting when their enemies couldn't see. Them coming. What about the other forts? Tom asked. Are they under threat too? Crow Feather shook his head. Only here, Running Bear. He wants this place very much. He thinks if he takes Fort Valiant, all the white soldiers will leave Apache land forever. It made strategic sense, Tom realized. Fort Valiant was the most isolated military post in the territory, making it an appealing target for someone wanting to demonstrate Apache power. If Running Bear could capture it and massacre the garrison, the psychological impact would be enormous. Other settlements might evacuate voluntarily, and the territorial government might reconsider its Apache policy. After Crow Feather left to water his horse and rest, Tom and Captain Dalton sat in silence, contemplating their options. They could try to evacuate the fort, but where would they go? The nearest safe haven was days away through hostile territory. They could send for help, but help wouldn't arrive in time. Or they could stay and fight, hoping that their defensive advantages would offset the Apache numerical superiority. What do you think? Dalton asked finally. I think we're going to find out what we're made of, Tom replied. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, ammunition was distributed, defensive positions were reinforced with sandbags and sharpened stakes. The soldiers worked with the grim efficiency of men who knew their lives depended on attention to detail. There was no joking, no casual conversation, just the steady sound of men preparing for war. Tom found himself assigned to organize the defense of the south wall, the most vulnerable section of the fort's perimeter. It faced the open desert, providing little natural protection and multiple avenues of approach for attacking forces. He spent the afternoon placing his men in positions that would provide overlapping fields of fire while offering maximum protection from Apache arrows and rifle bullets. As he worked, Tom was acutely aware of Kate's presence in the fort. She had spent the morning helping Dr. Whitman prepare medical supplies, rolling bandages and organizing medicines with the calm efficiency she had shown during the stagecoach attack. When Tom passed the infirmary, he could hear her voice through the open window, asking practical questions about treating gunshot wounds and arrow injuries. Around midday, she appeared at his elbow while he was supervising the construction of a firing step along the south wall. She wore the same gray dress as the night before, but had added a practical apron and tied her hair back with a simple ribbon. She looked like a woman preparing for serious work. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "Dr. Whitman says you have experience treating combat injuries. Could you spare a few minutes to show me some basic field medicine?" Tom paused in his examination of a rifle port, surprised by the request. Most women of Kate's background would be expected to faint at the sight of blood, not volunteer to treat wounds in the middle of a battle. But then again, Kate had already proven she wasn't most women. "Of course," he said, setting down his tools. "Though I hope you won't need to use what I teach you. So do I. But hope isn't a strategy, is it?" They walked together to the infirmary, where Dr. Whitman had laid out an array of medical supplies on a long wooden table. Bandages, scissors, bottles of carbolic acid, morphine tablets, and surgical instruments gleamed in the afternoon light, streaming through the windows. It looked more like a torture chamber than a place of healing. For the next hour, Tom taught Kate the basics of battlefield medicine. How to clean and dress wounds, how to recognize arterial bleeding, how to splint broken bones with whatever materials were available. She listened intently, asking questions that showed she understood both the procedures and their limitations. "The most important thing," Tom explained as he demonstrated pressure point techniques on her arm, "is to stay calm. Wounded men can sense panic, and it makes them harder to treat. If you act like you know what you're doing, they'll believe you do." Kate nodded, practicing the hand positions he had shown her. Her fingers were steady and sure, without the trembling that often affected people handling their first medical emergency. "What about pain management? How do you help someone who's badly hurt but conscious? Morphine, if we have it. Whiskey if we don't. But sometimes the best medicine is just staying with them, talking to them, letting them know they're not alone." Tom paused, remembering some of the men he had treated over the years. Dying is hard enough without doing it by yourself. Kate's hands stilled on the bandage she was rolling. "You've seen a lot of men die, haven't you?" "More than I care to count. Does it get easier?" Tom considered the question carefully. It was something people often asked, usually hoping for reassurance that human suffering became bearable with enough exposure. But that wasn't how it worked, at least not for him. "No," he said finally. "It gets different, but not easier. You learn to function despite it, to keep doing your job even when part of you wants to run away. But if it ever becomes easy, that's when you know you've lost something important." Kate resumed rolling the bandage, her movements slow and thoughtful. "Sergeant Hayes told me that's what makes you a good officer. You care about your men, even when caring hurts." The comment caught Tom off guard. He hadn't realized that Hayes paid such close attention to his leadership style, or that the sergeant thought well enough of him to mention it to Kate. It was strangely touching, knowing that his efforts to look after his soldiers had been noticed and appreciated. "Hayes is a good judge of character," Tom said, though he wasn't sure if he was referring to the sergeant's assessment of him or his choice in women. Their medical lesson was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps in the courtyard outside. Tom looked out the window to see Private Sullivan, the young soldier who had brought news of Hayes's predicament, racing toward the command building. Even from a distance, Tom could see the excitement and fear on the boy's face. "I should see what that's about," Tom said, already moving toward the door. Kate followed him into the courtyard, where they found Captain Dalton emerging from his office with a grim expression. Sullivan stood at attention, his chest heaving from exertion and his uniform dark with sweat. "Captain," Sullivan gasped. "Smoke." "Signals on Thunder Mesa. Crow Feather says it's Apache, telling all the war parties to get ready. They're coming tonight, sir, soon as it gets dark." The words hit the courtyard like a physical blow. Tonight. Not tomorrow, not the day after. Tonight, when the sun went down and the desert became a maze of shadows and whispered death. Tom felt his mouth go dry as the implications sank in. They had hours, not days, to complete their preparations. Captain Dalton's voice cut through the stunned silence. "All right, people, you heard the man. This is not a drill. I want every able-bodied soldier on the walls in 1 hour. Weapons check, ammunition distribution, final defensive preparations. Move!" The courtyard exploded into activity as soldiers ran to their assigned positions. Tom started toward the armory, then stopped as he realized Kate was still standing beside him, her face pale but composed. "Miss Hartwell," he said urgently, "you need to get to the safest part of the fort. The command bunker or the Whitman quarters, somewhere with thick walls and no windows." Kate shook her head. "I'll be in the infirmary. Dr. Whitman will need help when the wounded start coming in. That's not safe. The infirmary is too exposed, too close to the walls. If the Apache break through, nowhere in the fort will be safe," Kate interrupted. "At least in the infirmary I can be useful." Tom wanted to argue, wanted to grab her and drag her to safety, but there wasn't time. Already he could hear Sergeant Hayes calling his name from across the courtyard, probably needing him to help position the men on the south wall. "Be careful," Tom said, the words inadequate but all he had time for. Kate reached out and touched his arm, her fingers warm through the fabric of his uniform sleeve. "You too, Lieutenant. Come back alive." Then she was gone, disappearing into the infirmary to help Dr. Whitman prepare for the night's casualties. Tom watched her go, memorizing the way she moved, the determined set of her shoulders, the graceful line of her neck above the gray dress. Collar. If this was the last time he saw her alive, he wanted to remember every detail. The rest of the afternoon passed in a frantic rush of preparation. Ammunition was distributed to every firing position. Spare rifles were loaded and placed within easy reach, and the gaps between the defensive stakes were filled with tangled brush that would slow down attacking warriors. Tom moved constantly along the south wall, checking and rechecking his men's positions, making sure everyone understood their fields of fire and fallback positions. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, an unnatural quiet settled over Fort Valiant. The soldiers crouched behind their defensive positions, rifles ready, eyes scanning the empty landscape for signs of movement. In the distance, Thunder Mesa stood like a dark monument against the dying light, its flat top wreathed in smoke from Apache signal fires. Tom took a final walk along his section of the wall, stopping to speak quietly with each of his men. Some were veterans who had fought Apache before, their faces calm and determined. Others were younger, newer to the frontier, their eyes bright with fear and adrenaline. All of them understood what was at stake. "Remember," Tom told them, "Apache warriors are brave, but they're not stupid. They don't like taking heavy casualties any more than we do. If we make this attack cost them too much, they'll pull back and try a different approach. Our job is to make them pay for every yard of ground." As darkness fell over the desert, the waiting began. Tom positioned himself at the center of the south wall, where he could see the entire approach route and coordinate his men's fire. The night air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of sage and creosote from the surrounding hills. Somewhere out there in the darkness, perhaps 100 Apache warriors were moving into position, preparing to attack. Tom thought about Kate, probably tending to wounded men by lamplight in the infirmary. He thought about Hayes, commanding the east wall with the steady competence that had kept him alive through 20 years of army service. He thought about Captain Dalton, carrying the weight of command and the lives of everyone in the fort on his shoulders. But mostly, he thought about the next few hours and what they would bring. By dawn, Fort Valiant would either still be in American hands, or it would be a smoking ruin filled with the bodies of everyone he cared about. There was no middle ground in this kind of warfare, no room for partial victories or negotiated settlements. It would be life or death, survival or destruction, with nothing in between. The first Apache war cry echoed across the desert just after midnight, wild and haunting in the darkness. It was answered by others, coming from different directions, creating a chorus of threats that seemed to surround the fort completely. Tom felt his pulse quicken as he strained his eyes against the darkness, searching for movement in the shadows. "Here they come," he whispered to the soldier beside him, and the words were carried down the line from man to man until everyone on the south wall knew that the battle for Fort Valiant had begun. The darkness came alive with movement, shapes flowing across the desert floor like water seeking its level. Tom pressed his eye to the rifle sight, tracking shadows that appeared and vanished among the scattered rocks and scrub brush beyond the fort's walls. The Apache warriors moved with supernatural silence, their moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. Only the occasional glint of starlight on metal betrayed their presence. "Steady, boys," Tom whispered to his men along the south wall. "Let them get close. Make every shot count." The waiting stretched like a bowstring pulled taut, every second an eternity of held breath and racing hearts. Tom could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. His finger rested lightly on the trigger of his rifle, ready to squeeze at the first clear target. Beside him, Private Martinez crossed himself and muttered a prayer in Spanish, the words barely audible above the sound of wind through the defensive stakes. A flash of movement caught Tom's eye, closer than before. An Apache warrior had broken cover near a cluster of barrel cacti, his war-painted face briefly visible in the starlight. Tom tracked him through his sights, waiting for the signal to open fire. The warrior carried a Winchester rifle, probably taken from some previous raid, and moved with the fluid grace of a man who had been fighting this war since childhood. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that spoke to Running Bear's tactical skill. War cries split the night as Apache warriors rose from concealment and charged toward the walls, their rifles spitting flame in the darkness. The sound was terrifying and beautiful at the same time, voices lifted in defiance against death and defeat. "Fire!" Tom shouted, and the south wall erupted in muzzle flashes and thunder. His first shot took the warrior with the Winchester in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him behind a clump of prickly pear. Tom worked the bolt of his rifle and searched for another target, his movements automatic after years of practice. Around him, his men fired as fast as they could reload, their bullets kicking up spurts of dust and rock chips among the charging Apache. But the warriors kept coming, flowing around the fallen like a river around stones. They had painted themselves for war, their faces and bodies decorated with symbols that told of courage and death and the willingness to embrace both. Some carried rifles, others traditional bows, all of them screaming their defiance at the night sky. An arrow whistled past Tom's ear, close enough that he felt the fletching brush his cheek. He ducked instinctively, then rose again to fire at a warrior who had reached the base of the wall. The bullet caught the man in the shoulder, staggering him but not dropping him. The warrior raised his bow for another shot, and Tom's second bullet finished what the first had started. All along the fort's perimeter, the battle raged with savage intensity. Tom could hear the crack of rifles from the east wall where Hayes commanded, the deeper boom of the artillery piece that Captain Dalton had positioned to cover the main gate. Somewhere in the darkness, Apache warriors were dying, but they were taking soldiers with them, and the math of attrition was not in the fort's favor. "Lieutenant," Corporal Morrison's voice cut through the gunfire. "They're massing for another charge on the southeast corner." Tom peered into the darkness where Morrison pointed and saw the shapes gathering like storm clouds. At least 20 warriors, maybe more, preparing to rush a section of wall where the defensive stakes were sparse. If they broke through there, they could flank the entire south wall and turn the fort's defenses inside out. "Martinez, Williams, follow me." Tom vaulted over the parapet and dropped into the courtyard, his boots hitting the packed earth with jarring force. Behind him came his two best marksmen, their rifles ready and their faces grim with determination. They ran across the open ground toward the threatened section, their footsteps echoing off the adobe buildings. As they reached the corner position, Tom could see the Apache warriors moving into position for their assault, dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the charge began. Tom and his men threw themselves behind the low earthwork that protected the corner, their rifles thrust through the firing ports. The Apache warriors were close enough now that Tom could see individual faces, painted for war and twisted with battle fury. Some looked barely old enough to shave. Others were grizzled veterans with scars that spoke of many fights. The charge came with a sound like thunder, dozens of moccasined feet, pounding against the earth in unison. War cries split the air as the warriors rushed forward, their weapons glinting in the starlight. Tom aimed at the lead warrior, a tall man with eagle feathers in his hair, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and the warrior stumbled and fell, but another immediately took his place. Tom worked the bolt and fired again, then again, his shots precise and deadly. Beside him, Martinez and Williams maintained a steady rate of fire, their bullets cutting down warriors who came too close to the wall. But there were too many attackers and too few defenders, and Tom knew they couldn't hold this position much longer. An Apache warrior reached the wall and began climbing the defensive stakes, his knife clenched between his teeth and his eyes blazing with killing fury. Tom swiveled his rifle and put a bullet through the man's heart at point-blank range, watching him fall backward into the darkness. But two more warriors were already scrambling up behind him, and Tom's rifle was empty. He drew his Colt revolver and began firing, the heavy .45 caliber bullets stopping the climbers in their tracks. But the Apache kept coming, flowing over the bodies of their fallen comrades like water over rocks. Tom heard Martinez cry out as an arrow sprouted from his throat, sending him tumbling backward with blood bubbling from his lips. "Fall back!" Tom shouted, grabbing Williams by the shoulder and dragging him away from the overrun position. "Fall back to the inner perimeter." They ran across the courtyard as Apache warriors poured through the breach in the wall behind them. Tom could hear their war cries growing louder, closer, and he knew that Fort Valiant's outer defenses had been compromised. Now it would be a fight from building to building, room to room, until every last defender was dead. As they reached the command building, Tom saw Captain Dalton emerge from the doorway with his pistol drawn. The captain's uniform was torn and bloody, and his left arm hung useless at his side. But his eyes were still sharp, still focused on the tactical situation. "How bad?" Dalton asked, having to shout over the sound of gunfire and screaming. "Southeast corner's gone," Tom reported. "Maybe 15, 20 warriors through the breach. We need to seal it off, or they'll roll up the whole perimeter." Dalton nodded grimly. "Take what men you can find and set up a defensive line at the Faimwa stables. I'll try to organize a counterattack from the north side." Tom gathered every available soldier he could find, a motley collection of walking wounded and frightened young recruits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the Miley world. But they were what he had to work with, and he'd seen green troops perform miracles when their backs were to the wall. They took position behind the horse troughs and hay bales that lined the stable area, their rifles aimed at the gap where the Apache warriors would have to emerge from the courtyard. Tom checked his ammunition and found he had 4 rounds left in his revolver and perhaps a dozen rifle cartridges. Not much for what was coming, but it would have to do. The first Apache warriors appeared at the corner of the command building, moving cautiously now that they were inside the fort's perimeter. They had taken casualties getting through the wall, and their initial charge had spent itself against the prepared defenses. Now they would have to fight more carefully, using cover and stealth instead of overwhelming force. Tom sighted on the lead warrior and squeezed the trigger, watching the man spin and fall as the bullet took him in chest. The other warriors immediately took cover, disappearing behind buildings and equipment like shadows melting into darkness. The battle had entered a new phase, deadly and personal, where every corner might hide an enemy and every step could be your last. For the next hour, the fight raged through the interior of Fort Valiant. Apache warriors tried to advance toward the command building and the infirmary, while Tom's makeshift defensive line held them back with carefully aimed rifle fire. Bodies began to accumulate in the narrow spaces between buildings, soldiers, and warriors alike falling to bullets and arrows in the darkness. Tom found himself thinking about Kate, somewhere in the infirmary with Dr. Whitman, probably treating wounded men while the battle raged around them. The medical building was protected by thick adobe walls, but if the Apache broke through the defensive lines, those walls wouldn't save anyone inside. He had to hold here, had to keep the warriors from reaching the most vulnerable parts of the fort. A movement caught his eye, a figure slipping between the shadows near the water tower. Tom tracked the shape through his rifle sights, waiting for a clear shot. The figure moved with the fluid grace of an experienced warrior, using every scrap of cover to avoid detection. When he finally stepped into the open, Tom was ready. The rifle shot echoed off the buildings, and the warrior stumbled but didn't fall. Tom had hit him, but not cleanly, and the wounded man managed to reach cover behind a pile of supply crates. Tom cursed under his breath and worked the bolt of his rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. The wounded warrior reappeared moments later, trying to circle around the defensive position from the left. But Private Williams had anticipated the move, and his bullet caught the Apache in the head, dropping him instantly. Williams was young, barely 20, but he had the instincts of a born fighter. "Good shot," Tom called softly, and Williams grinned despite the desperate nature of their situation. The grin disappeared as an arrow sprouted from Williams's shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the horse trough behind him. Tom spun toward the source of the shot and saw an Apache warrior crouched on the roof of the supply building, his bow already knocked with another arrow. Tom's rifle swung up and fired in one smooth motion, the bullet taking the warrior in the chest and sending him tumbling from the roof. But the damage was done. Williams was badly wounded, his shoulders streaming blood, and Tom's defensive line was down to half strength. More Apache warriors appeared at the edges of the stable area, moving with increased confidence now that they had seen the defenders' weakness. Tom counted at least 8 men, all armed with rifles or bows, all painted for war. His own force consisted of himself, 2 unwounded soldiers, and 3 walking wounded who could barely hold their weapons steady. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Unless help arrived soon, they would all be dead within the hour. That's when Tom heard the sound that changed everything. Hoofbeats coming from the direction of the main gate. Lots of them, approaching at a gallop through the night. For a moment, he thought it might be more Apache mounted warriors coming to finish what their comrades had started. But then he heard a familiar voice shouting commands in English. 7th Cavalry. Make way for the 7th Cavalry. Relief flooded through Tom like cold water in the desert. Reinforcements had arrived, though how they had gotten here so quickly was a mystery he would ponder later. Right now, all that mattered was that the tide of battle was about to turn. The Apache warriors heard the approaching cavalry too, and Their advance faltered as they realized their tactical situation had changed. They were now caught between the fort's defenders and a mounted force of unknown size, trapped in the open courtyard with limited escape routes. Running Bear's carefully planned assault was about to become a disaster. Tom seized the moment, rising from cover and shouting to his men, "Now! Hit them now while they're confused." The remaining defenders opened fire with everything they had, their bullets cutting down Apache warriors who were suddenly exposed and vulnerable. At the same time, cavalry troopers poured through the main gate, their sabers gleaming in the lamplight as they charged into the courtyard. The Apache fought with desperate courage, knowing that retreat was no longer possible. Some tried to climb back over the walls they had breached. Others attempted to fight their way through the cavalry charge. But they were outnumbered now, caught in a crossfire that gave them no chance of survival. Tom saw Running Bear himself, the famous war chief who had terrorized the territory for years. The Apache leader stood near the command building, a Winchester, rifle in his hands and defiance written across his painted face. He was shooting at the cavalry troopers, trying to rally his scattered warriors for one last stand. Tom took careful aim and fired, his bullet taking Running Bear in the chest and dropping him to his knees. The war chief looked directly at Tom across the battle-torn courtyard, their eyes meeting for one brief moment. Then Running Bear fell forward onto his face, and the Apache resistance collapsed like a house of cards. The surviving warriors threw down their weapons or attempted to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Those who surrendered were taken prisoner. Those who ran were cut down by cavalry sabers. Within minutes, the battle was over, the courtyard littered with bodies and the air thick with gunpowder smoke. Tom lowered his rifle and looked around at the carnage, feeling the familiar mixture of relief and revulsion that followed every engagement. They had won, but the cost had been terrible. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, soldiers and Apache alike, their blood mixing in the dust. Some of them were men Tom had served with for years, friends whose jokes and stories had helped pass the long, lonely hours of frontier duty. Captain Dalton emerged from the command building, supported by 2 troopers and looking like he needed immediate medical attention. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were alert and focused on the task of reorganizing his scattered forces. "Lieutenant Brennan," he called, his voice weak but audible. "Status report. Southeast wall is breached, sir, but the courtyard is secure. We've got wounded men scattered all over the fort who need medical attention. What about casualties?" Tom did a quick mental count of the men he had seen fall during the fighting. The numbers were grim, but not as bad as they could have been. 8 dead, maybe 15 wounded. "Could have been worse, sir." "Could have been a lot worse," agreed the cavalry captain who had led the relief force, a weathered man with colonel's eagles on his shoulders. "Colonel Nathan Armstrong, 7th. Cavalry, we got your courier's message and rode through the night to get here." Tom stared at the colonel in confusion. "Sir, we didn't send any courier. Captain Dalton sent a message to Fort Apache, but that was yesterday afternoon." Armstrong frowned, equally puzzled. "We intercepted a courier on the Phoenix Road 2 days ago. Young woman, claimed she was carrying dispatches from Fort Valiant requesting immediate assistance. Said there was going to be a major Apache attack." A chill ran down Tom's spine as he realized what had happened. Someone had anticipated the attack and sent for help without authorization. Someone with the courage to ride alone through Apache country to save lives. There was only one person at Fort Valiant who fit that description. "Excuse me, sir," Tom said, already moving toward the infirmary. "I need to check on our wounded." He ran across the courtyard, stepping over bodies and scattered equipment, his heart pounding with more than just exertion. The infirmary door stood open, lamplight spilling out into the darkness, and Tom could hear voices inside. Dr. Whitman's voice, calm and professional, giving instructions for treating wounded men. And another voice, familiar and beloved, responding with quiet competence. Tom stepped through the doorway and saw Kate kneeling beside a wounded trooper, her hands steady as she cleaned a bullet wound in the man's arm. Her gray dress was stained with blood, and her hair had come loose from its pins, but she worked with the same calm efficiency she had shown during the stagecoach attack. She looked up as Tom entered, and their eyes met across the crowded room. In that moment, Tom saw everything he needed to know. The courage that had driven her to ride for help when no one else would take the risk. The intelligence that had let her anticipate the attack and understand what needed to be done. The strength that had carried her through another night of violence. And death without breaking. "You sent the courier," Tom said quietly, the words not quite a question. Kate nodded, not stopping her work on the wounded trooper's arm. "Someone had to. The odds were too long, the stakes too high. I couldn't just sit here and hope for the best. You could have been killed. Apache war parties were all over that country. I could have been killed here too, if the fort had fallen." Kate finished bandaging the trooper's wound and moved to the next patient, a young private with an arrow wound in his leg. "At least this way, I was doing something useful instead of just waiting for the end." Tom wanted to say more, to tell her how proud he was of her courage, how grateful he was that she had saved all their lives. But the infirmary was full of wounded men who needed attention, and this wasn't the time for personal conversations. "Is Sergeant Hayes?" Tom began, then stopped, not sure he wanted to hear the answer. "He's alive," Kate said without looking up from her patient. "Arrow wound in the shoulder, but he'll recover. Dr. Whitman is treating him in the back." Room. Relief flooded through Tom, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relief. Hayes was his friend and comrade, and Tom should have been purely glad that the man had survived. The fact that his feelings were more complicated than that said things about his character that he didn't want to examine too closely. "I should go check on him," Tom said. "You should," Kate agreed, still not meeting his eyes. "He was asking about you earlier, wanted to know if you had made it through the fighting." Tom made his way to the back room, where he found Hayes lying on a narrow cot with his shoulder wrapped in clean bandages. The sergeant looked pale and tired, but his eyes were alert and focused. He managed a weak smile when he saw Tom in the doorway. "Tom, you made it. Good to see you in one piece." "Same here, Bill. How are you feeling?" "Like I got kicked by a horse, but I'll live. Dr. Whitman says the arrow missed the major blood vessels." Hayes struggled to sit up, then thought better of it and remained prone. "Hell of a fight out there. Heard you held the southeast corner until the cavalry arrived." "We held what we could. Lost some good men doing it." Hayes nodded soberly. "Always do in this business. Price of keeping. Civilization moving west, I suppose." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. Two soldiers who had survived another battle, but knew there would always be more to come. Finally, Hayes spoke again, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer." "Of course." "Miss Hartwell, Kate, you have feelings for her, don't you?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying campfire. Tom considered lying, denying what was probably obvious to anyone. Who cared to look? But Hayes deserved better than that, deserved honesty from the man who had risked his life to save him. "Yes," Tom said simply, "I do." Hayes absorbed this admission without visible surprise or anger. Instead, he seemed almost relieved, as if Tom had confirmed something he had already suspected. "She's a remarkable woman," Hayes said finally. "Brave, intelligent, capable of things most ladies would never dream of attempting. Any man would be lucky to have her. She came here to marry you, Bill. That means something." "Does it?" Hayes's expression was thoughtful, almost sad. "She came here to marry a stranger, Tom, someone she knew only through letters. That's not the same thing as choosing a man she loves." Tom didn't know what to say to that. The mail order. Bride system was common on the frontier, a practical solution to the shortage of marriageable women in remote areas. But it was based on necessity rather than affection, arrangement rather than attraction. Most such marriages worked out well enough, growing into genuine partnerships over time. But some didn't, and there was no way to know which category any particular match would fall into. "What are you saying, Bill?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling as if the answers he needed might be written there. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "I'm saying that maybe I'm too old and set in my ways to make a woman like Kate happy. Maybe she deserves someone who can give her the kind of life she's capable of building, instead of just the kind of life I'm capable of providing. You're a good man, Bill, one of the best I've served with." "Being good isn't the same as being right for someone," Hayes replied. "Kate needs a partner, not a protector. Someone who can match her courage and intelligence, not just appreciate it from a distance." Tom felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of hope and guilt that left him feeling off balance and uncertain. "What are you going to do?" "Talk to her, I suppose. Find out what she really wants, not what she thinks she's supposed to want." Hayes managed a weak smile. "Don't look so worried, Tom. If she chooses you, I'll be happy for both of you. Life's too short for jealousy and regret." As Tom left the infirmary and walked back across the battle-scarred courtyard, he found himself thinking about choices and consequences, about the difference between duty and desire. The Apache attack was over, the immediate threat had passed, but in some ways the most difficult part was just beginning. Hearts and lives had to be sorted out, decisions made that would affect everyone involved. The sun was beginning to rise over the eastern hills, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. It was a new day at Fort Valiant, bought with blood and courage and the kind of sacrifice that the history books never quite managed to capture. Tom stood for a moment in the morning light, surrounded by the debris of battle, and wondered what this new day would bring. 3 days passed before the last of the wounded were stable enough for Tom to seek out Kate. He found her at sunset behind the infirmary, tending a small garden that Dr. Whitman's wife had planted years earlier. The columbines were blooming. Despite the harsh desert climate, their delicate petals a splash of purple and white against the red earth. Kate looked up as his shadow fell across the flowers, her green eyes reflecting the dying light. She had changed into a simple blue dress, clean and pressed, though Tom could still see the faint stains on her hands from days of nursing wounded soldiers. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, rising from her knees and brushing dirt from her skirt. "I heard Colonel Armstrong's men are leaving tomorrow. At first light, they're needed back at Fort Apache." Tom removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "Kate, we need to talk." She nodded toward a wooden bench that someone had placed among the flowers, probably Dr. Whitman during one of his philosophical moods. They sat together in the gathering twilight, close enough that Tom could smell the faint scent of lavender. Soap in her hair. "Sergeant Hayes told me about your conversation," Kate said, saving Tom the difficulty of beginning. "He's a good man, Tom, better than I deserve, probably." "That's not true, isn't it?" Kate picked a columbine from the garden, twirling the delicate flower between her fingers. "I came here under false pretenses, promising to marry a man I'd never met. Then I fell in love with someone else before I'd even spoken to my intended husband. What does that make me?" "Human," Tom said simply. "It makes you human." Kate smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since the night of the attack. "You always know the right thing to say, don't you?" "Not always. Most of the time I don't know what to say at all." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, the desert cooling around them with the swift transition that marked this harsh country. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild in the growing darkness. "I have to leave Fort Valiant," Kate said finally, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "I can't stay here, not after everything that's happened. It wouldn't be fair to Bill, and it wouldn't be fair to you." Tom felt his heart sink, though he had expected this moment from the beginning. "Where will you go?" Phoenix, maybe. Or, back to St. Louis. I have some money saved, enough to start over somewhere. Kate crushed the columbine in her hand, its petals falling like snow onto her blue skirt. There's a teacher shortage in Phoenix. I could make a life there. Alone? Kate turned to look at him, her green eyes searching his face in the starlight. That depends. On what? On whether you're asking me to stay. The words hung between them like a bridge that might bear their weight or collapse beneath them. Tom thought about duty and honor, about the promises that bound people together, and the courage required to break them when they became chains instead of choices. I'm asking, he said quietly. Not as an officer to a civilian, not as a man to a woman who belongs to someone else. I'm asking as Tom Brennan to Kate Hartwell, if she have me. Kate's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his own. What about your career? Army regulations don't look kindly on officers who steal their friends' intended brides. Let me worry about regulations. Tom brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I've spent 5 years following orders and doing my duty. Maybe it's time I followed my heart instead. And if your heart leads you away from the Army? Tom considered this, weighing the life he had built against the life he wanted to build. The Army had given him purpose and structure, a place to belong in a world that often seemed hostile and uncertain. But it had also kept him isolated, cut off from the deeper connections that gave life meaning. Then I'll follow it away from the Army, he said finally. There are other ways to serve, other ways to make a difference. The territory needs teachers, and doctors and builders, not just soldiers. Kate leaned against his shoulder, her head fitting perfectly in the hollow beneath his chin. Bill asked me to marry him this afternoon. Properly, I mean, not just the arrangement we had through letters. Tom's chest tightened. What did you tell him? I told him I was honored by his proposal, but that my heart belonged to someone else. He said he already knew, had known since the night you brought him back from Eagle Rock. Kate lifted her head to look at Tom again. He's releasing me from our engagement. Says he wants both of us to be happy, even if it means he'll be alone. He won't be alone forever. Bill Hayes is too good a man to stay single long. I hope you're right. Kate stood up, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. Tom, there's something else you should know. About the courier I sent to Fort Apache. You saved all our lives, Kate. There's nothing to explain. There is, actually. Kate walked to the edge of the garden, where the neat rows of flowers gave way to the wild desert beyond. I didn't just ride out randomly, hoping to find cavalry patrols. I knew exactly where to go because I had help. Tom felt a chill despite the warm evening air. What kind of help? Joseph Crowfeather, the Pima scout who brought news of the Apache movements. He found me the night before the attack, said he'd been watching the fort and knew what was coming. He offered to guide me to the cavalry column in exchange for a promise. What promise? Kate turned back to face him, her expression troubled. That I would convince the Army to hire more Pima scouts, give his people steady work instead of just occasional payments. The Pima hate the Apache as much as we do, but they need income to survive. Crowfeather sees the writing on the wall, knows that his people have to adapt or die. Tom absorbed this information, understanding now how Kate had managed to reach the cavalry in time. Crowfeather knew the desert better than any white scout, could travel distances in hours that would take others days. But he had also taken an enormous risk, helping a white woman traverse Apache country during the most dangerous time possible. Does Captain Dalton know? I told him this morning. He's agreed to recommend increased use of Pima scouts to the territorial commander. It won't solve all their problems, but it's a start. Tom smiled, shaking his head in amazement. Even in the midst of saving the fort, Kate had been thinking about justice and fairness, trying to help people who had helped her. It was exactly the kind of thing she would do, and exactly the kind of thinking the territory needed more of. "So you negotiated a treaty while riding through Apache country to save our lives," he said. "Is there anything you can't do?" "I can't cook," Kate admitted with a laugh. "Dr. Whitman's wife has been very polite about the biscuits I made yesterday, but I saw her feeding them to the chickens when she thought I wasn't looking." Tom laughed too, the sound carrying across the desert like a promise of better times. "Ahead, I can cook. One of the first things you learn as a soldier is how to make something edible out of whatever you can find." "Another reason to marry you, then. Is that a yes?" Kate walked back to him, her movements graceful in the starlight. When she reached the bench, she didn't sit down but instead stood directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. "Thomas Brennan," she said formally, "are you proposing marriage to me?" Tom stood up, taking her hands in both of his. "Catherine Hartwell, will you marry me? Not because it's convenient or practical or expected, but because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life discovering what an extraordinary woman you are." "Yes," she said simply, and then she was in his arms, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted of columbines and desert wind and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Tom realized that the loneliness that had followed him for years was gone, replaced by something warm and solid and real. He had found someone worth coming home to, someone who made the word home mean something more than just a place to sleep between battles. "When?" Kate asked, her arms still around his neck. "Tomorrow if you want. Colonel Armstrong could perform the ceremony before his men leave." "That soon?" "I've waited long enough to find you," Tom said, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I don't want to wait any longer to make you my wife." They were married the next morning in the Fort's Chapel, a simple adobe building that had seen more funerals than weddings, but welcomed this celebration with quiet dignity. Kate wore her blue dress with the silver columbine brooch that she had somehow kept through all the chaos, while Tom appeared in his dress uniform with its brass buttons gleaming like small suns. Sergeant Hayes stood as Tom's best man, his arm still in a sling but his face peaceful and genuinely happy. Colonel Armstrong performed the ceremony with military precision and surprising warmth, pronouncing them husband and wife as the desert sun climbed toward its zenith. As they kissed to seal their vows, Tom heard the sound of cavalry bugles playing reveille in the distance, calling the 7th Cavalry to prepare for their departure. But for once, the sound of military duty didn't call to him. His duty now was to the woman in his arms, to the life they would build together in this harsh and beautiful country. That afternoon, as Colonel Armstrong's column disappeared into the heat shimmer beyond the fort's walls, Tom and Kate stood together on the ramparts, watching the desert reclaim the tracks left by horses and men. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about their future, but today they had each other, and that was enough. The columbines in Dr. Whitman's garden bloomed on, delicate and determined, proving that beautiful things could grow even in the hardest ground. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.